People in the Metis community that they saw this beadwork and that's why their beadwork in this community had changed. And so that's how I started it, figuring somebody else had written about it, and apparently they hadn't.
Where did the beads actually originally from? Where did they came from?
The beads all come from Europe, and beads are an interesting thing. We've probably all heard the story.
You don't see beading in Europe, European museums. Where did these little things come from?
Well, beads were really neat because at one point there was only two places that beads were made, Milan and Czechoslovakia, and they were glass beads, and they're actually pretty valuable. And while beadwork did exist in Europe, it existed in a very different way. So you get little beaded handbags. You would get beading in, on elaborate garments where it would be a case of, again, smaller detail. Think about the way we, even now, if you see somebody that's on the catwalk or somebody that's on the red carpet and they might have a beaded dress, it's done very differently. So it's done as a decorative element. And done in a different way, and has a completely different incorporation to it, but they were still considered very precious because it was all part of this glass making. So when traders came over here, that was a very compact way of carrying something of high value. So when you see people, you hear those things, oh, well, is it true that the Indians of Manhattan traded off the entire island of Manhattan for a few beads? Or, oh my gosh, how could people give up so much stuff for furs? It's all about relative value. And so when they were bringing beads over, beads weren't trinkets. They were a very compact form of currency. And that when those first furs were being traded for, it's really funny because the initial contact that people had, I don't know how much you know about beaver pelts, but made beaver was the form of currency eventually, and it has to do with the made, meaning it's got the rougher part of the fur. Beavers have there's two layers to the pelt. One, the soft part, and then the coarse part. And it's a soft part that you take and you felt. And that's why everybody wanted beaver pelts, was that you take this fur and it's treated in a way and soaked and felted and dyed so that it could be shaped into a hat. So there was a big market for things like the top hat, the tricorn hat. People were obsessed by different kinds of hats in Europe, and as a result, they had pretty much wiped out the indigenous beaver population in Europe. So when folks got over here, that was one of the things. They were looking for different kinds of fur, including beaver, to make hats. What we don't usually hear about in the history books is that in those first forms of contact and those first trades for beads and other things that we would now say are trinkets, well, if you think about the fact that you're an Aboriginal woman and to decorate clothing, you're doing things like taking porcupine quills and you're softening them with your teeth and chewing them and dyeing them with plants that you're having to grind up and make dyes. And again, you wear out your teeth. You're sewing things with bone needles and with sinew. You're doing things with everything from deer hooves and other kinds of bones. All of these things are really labor intensive. So imagine sitting there working on this kind of stuff. You've got your winter clothes out airing, because that's the other thing too, is that folks, you tended to wear often in colder weather two kinds of fur. You had one type of fur aimed in and another fur aimed out. One was sort of your long johns, one was your protection from the outer wind. Well, imagine sitting there, you're working on that, you hear some scuffling over by the riverbank, and then your husband talking to somebody, and then I'm coming back and sort of going, honey, you're not going to believe this. There's some kind of pasty white guys over here. They've got some really interesting stuff. It looks like some knives and some other kind of containers. Come take a look. But they want to, the stuff that we got leaning over there, basically, how you were refreshing our long underwear? Yeah, they want that. Come take a look at these things. They want, don't ask me, but come take a look. Some of it looks really neat. And then him having it again, there's your little language barrier, and she's going, darn right, I'm going to take this stuff. Look at that. That is so cool. I can, hold on, look at how that's threaded on there. Yeah, I can do this. Buddy wants to take the long underwear, let him have it. You don't mind catching a few more things before, we got time. I can always whip together a new set of long johns for the fall. This is the equivalent of somebody showing up at your house the day before laundry day saying, hey, guess what? Give me your laundry basket and all of its contents. I got a bunch of iPads, iPhones, and, you know, a 70-inch TV. Would you be like, I would be like, okay, fine, hold on, and I think my 10-year-old has got something hidden under his bed. Hold on, I think there's a dirty sweatsuit in here. Can I get an iPhone for that? What ended up happening is that they would become dependent on these things, and that's where the shift would happen, and they would start, the hunting would change, animal populations would get wiped out, and that's where you'd have this entire shift in the fur trade. So yeah, glass beads were basically a cheap, or not cheap, they were a small compact form of currency that happened to be very popular, again, across North America. And what's really interesting is to see how each place adapted to them differently. So some places, like when you look at the Sioux, would still do the geometric patterns, very much associated with the quill work that they had done. And they would then also go into figurative work because they used to, in addition to doing quill work, which again would have a geometric pattern, would also paint on garments. So they would take that figurative painting style and adapt it to beads. So each place, each culture group did its own neat thing, and the Metis became known as the flower beadwork people because they were so, their style of floral work was so wonderful and unique. I won't go into all the wacky kinds of, this is some crazy academic stuff, but what's interesting is I do want to do a little bit of a comparison in terms of, these were the religious garments used by the oblate priests at the time. So again, floral patterns were very predominant, and they still tend to be very predominant in a lot of things. So again, flowers are in nature. It's not unusual that they would show up in human beings' art. These are, again, some more things that were embroidered by the nuns. And so, yes, you do see a certain style. There's a much more elaborate one. And this is where people would often say, oh, well, this looks, you know, this is the kind of stuff that's influencing the Métis. And these are some drawings from some pattern books that were taken, again, from a variety of different places. So this is where, again, people were trying to make connections and those early studies of what kind of floral patterns. So these are floral patterns taken off a Métis knife. This is a pattern that comes from a pattern book that was found in St. Boniface and that, again, was used by the nuns to make some of the garments that they did and do some of the other work that the Grey Nuns did. Again, this is the Parisian pattern book that they used, and you can see just how elaborate, and again, but a very different kind of elaborate. You're not going to see these kind of leaf patterns, these kind of scrolling patterns in Métis art. This is, when you ask about what kind of beadwork was done, this is an example of how a North American would bead something, and this is a beaded wall pocket. So this, the reason why beading was done at this point by European and North American women was it was part of the womanly arts. So if you were an upper class woman and you weren't the kind of woman that would be cooking her own meals, you still had to be doing something womanly. And so that meant that you became very good at embroidering and beadworking and maybe doing little botanical paintings. And that's where, again, you would get the pattern for that kind of embroidery on the flowers. This, on the other hand, these are patterns that are taken from Anishinaabe or Ojibwe designs. They're a little different, and they reflect more the kinds of flowers that you would actually see in Métis beadwork. The difference is these earlier ones, these coming from the maternal cultures, would actually, again, tend to be a little bit more geometrical, and again, a lot of that came from using quill work and having to do, you don't have the same freedom of movement, so it's much easier to do something, or to try to do something symmetrical, rather than doing something organic with it. And again, here's some more examples. I just wanted to sort of throw in the kinds of things that you might end up seeing. And again, lots of elaborate little flowers that would eventually develop in different places in terms of the layers and layers and the outlines that you can see on the ones on the far side. But again, this is where you'd see that similarity where somebody would say, oh, well, because a flower bud has been done here and it looks like the flower bud that was done by the nuns, it must have been the nuns. And it's like, well, actually, you know, there's this wacky idea. The flower buds exist in nature, and these women would have seen them in nature because they would have been harvesting these plants in many cases. Here's the bag that was given to George Simpson in 1854, and it's in the Manitoba Museum. And again, it was given to him in the St. Peter's area. So again, there's some debate as to whether it's Métis or not. My belief is that it is of Métis background, just again in terms of how florid the design is. These are other examples of a different kind of bag, a beaded pipe bag, where the beading is only on a panel and affixed, but again shows a very elaborate floral style and the two sides being different. These, now we get into the collections that are at the St. Boniface Museum, and these are part of the Lachemodier family collection. And this is a very elaborate, tiny panel on these leggings around the back, and the beads are so tiny. It's just, it's phenomenal, but again, a very dynamic, compressed, active design that is not seen paralleled in other cultural areas. This one I love. This is the Lachemodier. This belonged to Jean-Baptiste de la Prairie. He tended to, because Jean-Baptiste, you know how, I don't know if anybody's familiar, the Kids in the Hall had a song, These Are the Daves I Know, based on somebody knowing a whole bunch of guys named Dave. Well, in about the 1800s, it would be, oh, these are the Jean-Baptistes I know. And so, so they all had little petit noms. So he was La Prairie. So this is Jean-Baptiste de la Prairie's, Lachemodier's watch pocket. He would have put his watch in there. Now, these floral patterns here are very common, and you'd see this kind of patterning and the intricate and very tiny little, can't see it too well here, but there's different shades of red in there. What's interesting is this flower right here. And can you guess what it is?
Is it a crocus?
What's that?
Crocus, is it?
No.
No?
It's a bearded iris.
Oh.
It's a plant indigenous to this area and indigenous along a good part of the fur trade. And you'll notice how it kind of sticks out, right? Like at first you just go, ooh, floral pattern, but then all of a sudden you go, wait a second, everything is pink and red, a little bit of green. What's this little purple and blue thing doing over here? Well, the iris is part of the onion family. It grows all along the fur trade area, back into the, again, along the Great Lakes area. In fact, I had a really funny thing happen. I thought it was kind of neat. My stepmother's family has a cottage in Mackenzie Beach in the Thunder Bay area, and it hadn't been used for a long, long time. And so everybody else and all the other cottages had kept their beach clear. And so so there's a lot of sand, and in their area, probably much to the chagrin of their neighbors, nature encroached back in, and you could watch these things emerging on the beach. They grow in a very sandy area. They're part of the onion family, and they're used for medicinal purposes. They are an iris. The iris is the source of the fleur-de-lis. In French, we're used to seeing fleur-de-lis, for example, on the Quebec flag, and being a way of asserting Francophone identity. Well, this is an interesting, shall we say, a thumbing of the nose to the Anglos in the neighborhood, because, hey, it's a pretty little floral design. And you know what? If I'm a Francophone Métis person, I'm having all of these Anglophones come into the neighborhood. Now, the other thing is, too, is because the Victorians liked florid floral designs, they kind of had mixed feelings about the Métis. Again, they didn't like some of the upstart qualities. But you know, when you looked at their beadwork, at least it wasn't that, you know, that savage geometric type like the Sioux were doing. So these people must be slightly more civilized. Again, they are half-breeds. Well, if you're dealing with that kind of a condescending, patronizing attitude, and people are claiming that your beadwork is nice because it's more civilized than the other type, this is your little way of kind of thumbing your nose at them, because, gee, if you were to do a stylized fleur-de-lis, that would be really obvious, wouldn't it? You do a much more naturalized, indigenous flower, and people go, oh my, what a cute little flower that is that you got on there, having no clue that, so this was coding. So this was the other part of what I did in my research, was the idea that, and this was part of the doctoral work, that the Métis communicated by beadwork. So that's the other thing. I'm curious as to what kind of photographs you have of this neighborhood, folks from this neighborhood. Take a look at their footwear. If somebody is in otherwise Western dress, but they still have moccasins on, or they have small beaded items like that, that tells you they're Métis.